You know about American whiskey, but whiskey is being made all across the Americas, North, Central, and South America. Hey there, I'm Nath Martin, the Whiskey Scribe. Taste is subjective, whiskey is diverse, and this channel is about understanding it well enough to enjoy it on your own terms. Now, I've been doing a series where I've been diving into every single country in the world that is making whiskey on a commercial level. So far I've covered Europe, I've covered Asia and Oceania, and now we're diving into the Americas. Now throughout the video I'll have a map that pops up here. This is not to scale, this is just as a reference point to show you where the country is. And so that I don't show any bias, I'm going to do this alphabetically top to bottom. So I'll go through everything in North, then Central, then South. And that starts us off with North America, with Canada, which has been making whiskey commercially since 1821. And yet the first legal distillery was established in 1832. I love that distinction between legal and not. The industry was largely pioneered by English, German, and Dutch settlers who were distilling surplus wheat to prevent spoilage. It was the Dutch and German immigrants who introduced a small amount of rye grain to add flavour to the whiskey, contributing to the Canadian profile. And strangely enough, Canadian whiskey today can still be called rye whiskey even if it doesn't even have rye grain in the mash bill. Today, most Canadian whiskies are blends of corn, rye, malt, and wheat to produce brands we know like Crown Royal, Canadian Club, 40 Creek, and lot number 40, which is actually 100% rye whiskey. But there's also a growing craft scene producing wonderful single malts like Shelter Point, Glen Breton, and Macaroni's Island Distillery. Fun fact, Canada was actually the first country in the world to make it a legal requirement for whiskey to be aged in barrels through legislation in 1887. Now, Greenland has been a whiskey-making country since 2014 with the launch of Icefjord Premium Arctic Single Malt Whiskey. They produce an award-winning peated and unpeated single malt made with centuries-old iceberg water, and Q Distillery is also laying down whiskey barrels. Now, Mexico has a really new craft whiskey industry that really leans into its agricultural traditions. So when they first released a whiskey in 2020, it wasn't a direct copy of bourbon. The Abaslo Ancestral Corn Whiskey uses 100% ancestral Cacahuacintul corn and nixtamalization, which is a 4,000-year-old cooking technique used to prepare corn for tortillas. But when using this cooking technique to make whiskey, it's meant to produce a lot of really roasted and earthy flavors. The distillery is also one of the highest in the world, at 7,800 feet. So at that altitude, the aging process is also quite unique. But since then, Mexico has also seen a number of other whiskies emerge, things like the Yucatan-based Gran Mazel, which also uses ancient corn varieties. There's also Sierra Norte, Curdo Negro, and Origin 35. Now, if you know your Prohibition history, you may have heard of Saint Pierre and Miquelon. It's a French archipelago just south of Newfoundland, and it's only home to about 6,000 residents, but during Prohibition, it was a major hub for alcohol smuggling. And so in 2018, the Saint Pierre Miquelon Distillery was established to revive this history, and in 2024 released their 3-year-old single malt, made and aged on the island. Am I missing anyone else in North America? Oh yeah, the United States. Whiskey has been made in the US since the 1600s by Irish and Scottish immigrants. Throughout the 1700s, the process adapted and innovated to suit the local conditions, so using things like corn and rye, transporting whiskey in barrels saw American oak become rather a norm for aging, and other innovations to reach the point of American whiskey that we know today. While the US is best known for bourbon whiskey with brands like Jim Beam, Maker's Mark, and Buffalo Trace, as well as rye whiskey like Rittenhouse Rye, Bullet Rye, and Michter's, there are several other whiskey styles like Jack Daniel's Tennessee whiskey, corn whiskies like Mellow Corn and Balcones Baby Blue, and there are also Scottish-style single malts being made like Stranahan's and Westwood whiskey. Moving down to Central America and the Caribbean, in Grenada, the Welcome Stone Distilling Co. is credited with being the producer of the first Caribbean whiskey, aptly named Caribbean whiskey. In spite of the tropical climate causing accelerated aging, it is still aged for 6 years, which is actually really impressive. Honduras's first, and as far as I can tell, only whiskey, actually has a really cool story. It was first released in 2023 as a collaboration between LA20 Imperial Stout Craft Beer and Clandestino Distilling Company, which is also a Prohibition-style speakeasy bar. They distilled the locally produced stout beer and aged it in a combination of oak and cherry wood. The result is meant to be bold and smoky with flavors of coffee, chocolate, and maple, but it is a proper craft release in that it's really only available sporadically, even in Honduras. The first whiskey ever produced in Panama is La Rana Dorada Single Malt, made by a local craft brewery. It was aged 3 years in virgin American oak and first released in 2022. But you also have Centeno 7. It's a craft whiskey, supposedly Canadian style, made from a single locally sourced grain. They don't say what grain, but considering they call themselves Canadian style, you would assume that that might be rye, but I can tell that it is actually aged in virgin white oak. Although Puerto Rico is best known for rum, they do kind of have a whiskey. There's a product called Buca whiskey, which is made in Puerto Rico and is grain-based spirit, but then it's also blended with port wine, which is probably delicious, but doesn't classify it as a whiskey by most countries' standards. But there is still a proper whiskey on the horizon. There is a micro distillery, Distilleria Capellan, that began laying down barrels in 2023 and is meant to be releasing a single barrel, single malt by the end of this year. And now moving down to South America, Argentina actually has quite a few whiskey distilleries, but the very first was La Alazana Distillery, which first released a single malt in 2014. It's a field-to-bottle whiskey made from locally grown barley and Patagonian spring water. I've actually tried this one and really enjoyed it, but since then a number of craft distilleries have also popped up producing craft whiskies. Things like Madoc Distillery using Andean-grown corn, and Casa Negra making single malt aged in Mendozan wine casks. Bolivia has one distillery producing whiskey, the Andean Culture Distillery, producing Killer Amburana. Now these sound like really unique whiskies shaped by the local terroir. They're made using chica, a Bolivian fermented corn beverage. Corn is a grain, it's still whiskey, along with wheat and Amazonian malts. And distilled at 13,000 feet. Now that altitude lowers the boiling point for alcohol, so it produces a very different flavor. And that spirit is then aged in Roble Chicotano, an oak native to eastern Bolivia. Brazil's first whiskey producer was Union Distillery, which first started distilling malt whiskey in 1972. But the bulk of this was being sent off to Japan to be used as bulk blending stock. In the 1980s, they released their first blended whiskies, but these were mostly for the export market. It was only in 2019 that they started bottling and releasing whiskies under their own label for the local and global market. But since then, Lamas Destilario released the first Brazilian single malt in 2019. Alba and Weber House are both laying down barrels with plans to release whiskies in the near future, and there are even some independent bottlers in the country. Chile became a whiskey producing country just this decade, with Wuvco Chilean Single Malt, first released in 2023, made from Araucanian malt and peat from Patagonia. There's now the Old Bastard Distillery, producing American-style moonshine, but their first aged spirit release, the Ayers Reserve Chilean Whiskey, won silver at the London Spirits Competition in 2025. And there are a few more craft distillers throughout the country also laying down whiskey barrels. Colombia has at least one distillery producing whiskey, Piatl, an 8-year-old small batch whiskey made from Capio corn and aged in French oak in the Andean highlands. Just over the border in Ecuador, the first locally made whiskey was released in 2021. Merco is a single malt made by Andes Spirits and also aged up in the Andean highlands. In the same year, Distilleria Sabo released their first whiskey aged in native Ecuadorian Pechiche barrels. Good Omen distillers are also laying down barrels with plans to release a whiskey. Paraguay actually had a foray into whiskey making in the 1980s. APAL partnered with the Morris and Bowmore distillers in Scotland to produce a Paraguayan whiskey they were calling Old Cottage, but the coup of 1989 brought an end to that project. Flash forward to today, and the state-owned Capasa is planning to revive that project to release a Paraguayan-made whiskey. However, the project in the 1980s was planning to release a spirit that was based on malt, rye, and sugarcane spirit. So if they're going to follow that same recipe, it's technically not going to be a whiskey. Not only does Peru have locally made whiskey, they also have a protected classification for Andean whiskey. So it must be produced in Peru and contain a mash bill of at least 51% Andean corn. The first whiskey released with this classification was Black Whiskey in 2019 by Don Michael Distillery, made from 60% Andean black corn, 30% malted wheat and 10% malted barley. It actually won World's Best Whiskey at the 2022 New York World Spirits Competition. So far, this seems to be the only whiskey made in Peru, but you would think with that sort of classification and protection that they're planning on a much wider whiskey industry. Lastly, Uruguay has been producing whiskey for decades through the state-owned ANCAP, but it's really difficult to work out what exactly is Uruguayan whiskey. There are a number of brands that use imported Scotch blended with local spirits to produce local labels. I don't really call that whiskey, but then some of their brands call themselves Scotch while claiming to be locally produced. As best as I can tell, Gregson's whiskey has been locally produced in Uruguay since 1969, and this differs from some of the other more ambiguous whiskey brands because Gregson's also has Gregson's Gold label that promotes itself as being more premium because it is blended with Scotch. So Uruguay claims to have a lot of locally produced whiskies, but it looks like they really only have one. But with that aside, I was still blown away by the number of countries throughout all of the Americas that have been releasing whiskey, especially new to the market in the last 5 years. So other than US and Canada, how many were you expecting? And funnily enough, there's probably even more. It's just, I'm unilingual, so it's a lot harder for me to try and find locally made products in countries that speak a different language. So if you know of any other countries that I missed in this list, please let me know. I'm always looking to try and explore and discover new whiskies. And don't forget, this video is part of a series where I'm exploring every single country around the world that is making whiskey. So hit the subscribe button to make sure you don't miss out on that. But I've already covered Europe, I've covered Asia and Oceania, and now we've gone right through the Americas. And lastly, I'm going to be finishing up next week by heading over to Africa and the Middle East. And again, you'll be surprised at how many countries there are making whiskey. But no matter where it's from, no matter where in the world, enjoy what's in your glass and slange.